Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's get week 22 underway with another Mailbag Monday. Now, Evan W. writes in with a fun speculation question. What if Aragorn died at the Black Gate? The ring is still destroyed and all the other major characters survive, except Aragorn. Do you think, he asks, Faramir would have become king, given that the line of Elendil was now over, or would the stewardship continue? Or do you think that Elladan and Elrohir would have made the same choice as their father and uncle, with one going with Elrond, remaining an elf, and the other choosing to begin a new line of kings of men, given that they would be the last of the descendants of Eärendil? That is an interesting set of questions and a really fun speculation to dive into, Evan. Setting the stage then for the speculation, Aragorn is the only important character to have died. Maybe the mouth of Sauron unexpectedly cut off his head. So Faramir is still alive, presumably comforting Éowyn in her time of grief. Imrahil has survived. Elladan and Elrohir have survived as well. Evan asks a few variations of the question, what would happen to the leadership in Gondor? Option 1, with the end of the line of Elendil, does Gondor elevate the ruling steward, now Faramir, to the kingship? Option 2, does Gondor stay with the rule of the stewards that they've been living under for nearly 1,000 years? Or option 3, do Elrond's sons echo the choices of Elrond and Elros, with one choosing to be of elf kind, going over the sea with his father, while the other chooses to become a mortal man, possibly establishing a new line of kings? And the question he didn't ask, would Gondor accept that rule? Let's take a look at the way each of these could work, and I'll speculate as to their likelihood. Option 1, Faramir being made king. Look, it's enticing, and as the world's biggest Faramir fan, I really love the idea, but I have to be honest and say that's not happening, or at least it's really, really unlikely to happen. Recall Faramir talking to Frodo about the history of Gondor, and specifically the line of stewards. This is from Book 4, Chapter 5, The Window on the West. Faramir says, "We of my house are not of the line of Elendil, though the blood of Númenor is in us. For we reckon back our line to Mardil, the good steward, who ruled in the king's stead when he went away to war. And that was King Eärnur, last of the line of Anarion, and childless, and he came never back. And the stewards have governed the city since that day, though it was many generations of men ago. And this I remember of Boromir as a boy, when we together learned the tale of our sires and the history of our city, that always it displeased him that his father was not king. How many hundreds of years needs it to make a steward a king if the king returns not?" he asked. "Few years, maybe, in other places of less royalty," my father answered. "In Gondor, 10,000 years would not suffice." Now, Faramir here seemed to quote his father approvingly, pointing out Boromir in contrast, whose pride was a bit impacted by the fact that his father was not king, and that in turn, neither would he become king. I don't think, even if Gondor were to ask him to be king, that Faramir would accept. And I doubt that Gondor would ask. Their history of succession crises leaves a lot to be desired. Let's take a look at those crises. Let's go back first to Falastur, whose name means Lord of the Coasts. He was the 12th king of Gondor and ruled from 3rd Age 830 to 913. Now, he died childless thanks to the nefarious, solitary, and loveless queen, the Queen of Cats herself, Beruthiel. Now, when he died, he was succeeded by his nephew, Eärnil I. No, not that Eärnil. Now, there's nothing particularly wrong with that transition, I suppose. It was certainly peaceful. The next one wasn't awful either. Narmakil I, the 17th king of Gondor, who ruled from 3rd Age 1226 to 1294, died childless, and he was succeeded by his younger brother, Calmakil. Now, both of them were totally lazy, and it was actually Calmakil's son, Minalcar, who served as regent under both kings and essentially did all the work of ruling. He would, of course, later take the throne as Romendikil II, the East Victor, who brought Northmen into his service and who built the Argonath. But the kin strife that engulfed Gondor a couple of generations after Romendikil II was another story. Now, that's a whole different Mailbag Monday, or maybe a Third Age Thursday or two, actually. But it's definitely an example of the throne of Gondor being caught up in a crisis of succession. There was another crisis of succession when Ondaher died in battle with both of his sons in Third Age 1944. Now, his daughter Firiel might have been made queen, or her husband Arvedwi, the last king of Arnor, who made a claim to the kingship on both those grounds. But the Council of Gondor gave it to Eärnil II, a great-great-grandson of Telumektar Umardakil, the king from 3 generations before Ondaher. Now, given that history, and given the fact that the stewards had been ruling as stewards for nearly 1,000 years, I think that A, Gondor would not have offered the kingship to anyone not of descent from Anarion, or barring that, at least of descent from Isildur. B, Faramir would have declined it even had it been offered to him. And so, C, we end up with option 2. The stewards just keep on ruling as stewards. And I think, if I were to be completely honest, that's the most likely option here. But I think option 3 may be one of the most interesting ones available. Would the sons of Elrond choose to echo the choices of their father and uncle? Would one choose to remain mortal and try to claim the kingship of Gondor? I mean, after all, if they both choose to be mortal, well, then we're looking at a crisis of another kind, and I hope Elrond's prepared for that. But maybe one stays behind and becomes mortal to keep Arwen company after the loss of her betrothed. And you know what? I want to be clear on that. It was Arwen's decision on Caren Amroth to pledge her troth to Aragorn that finalized her choice of mortality. So even with Aragorn's death and the wedding not happening, she's mortal now, so that's done. Anyway, as a descendant of Eärendil and a nephew of Elros, if either chose to try, they'd certainly have a pretty strong claim to the throne. But would Gondor accept what they might view as an elf, as a king? After all, Elros didn't have to convince an existing kingdom to change their ruler. He was the first king of Numenor. Nobody looked at him and said, oh, he's an elf, he can't rule over us. Now, Elladan or Elrohir would have a much larger hurdle to overcome in that particular regard, but as Faramir would be steward, I think he would willingly acknowledge either one of them as king, and his people who love him would follow. Now, that is an interesting alternate reality to consider. After all, either one of these two guys are way more than half elven. Even Elrond was more than half elven. He was actually 56% elven. And he married Celebrian, who, of course, is 100% elf, making Elladan and Elrohir more than 75% elf. But Elros was also 56% elven, like his twin brother Elrond. He chose mortality and was considered a man. So yeah, it could happen. And at least Arwen would have some family around for a bit. Now, folks, that wraps it up for Mailbag Monday. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please email it to barnleman@theprancingponypodcast.com. Let him know it's for today's Tolkien Times, and I'll get to it as soon as possible, with priority going to patrons of the show, of course. Now, please visit patreon.com/Tolkien Times to learn how you can support the show. Get an ad-free feed, a monthly hangout with me, a bonus weekly episode, and a whole lot more. And finally, join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Tolkien Tuesday, as we learn more about the professor himself. If you're watching this on YouTube, please be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And please follow or subscribe in your podcast apps if that's how you're listening. And follow @Tolkien Times on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. And finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.